Okay, well, I'm awfully pleased that Chuck is willing to do this for us. As he mentioned earlier, he was a teacher, a history teacher for,
30 years of high school and then about 6 years at the colleges.
yeah, and in retirement, you will continue to teach.
Yeah, at Osher at RIT.
So he's got a wealth of experience as a great teacher, and I'm looking forward to learning something about the Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee. Right.
We picking him up, Dave?
Hello, test. Test, test. Haudenosaunee. Apache. I'll tell you in a couple minutes. That's a great question. It's a great question. Are we ready to go then, Steve? Okay. I am not an expert on this topic. I know a few things about it, and I've learned a few things about it. So I'm very happy to share some of my knowledge with you. But please consider this my invitation to you to ask questions, and I've already had a number of questions. To ask questions, to make comments for the good of the forum, because you have a lot to add. And Cheryl Frank just walked in, so now I am totally intimidated because I'm sure she knows a heck of a lot more than I do. Cheryl's been a friend for a long time. She's one of my favorite people. So I'm not an expert, but I welcome and encourage questions. Hey, before I get started, does anybody remember who won the last Super Bowl? Yeah, the most recent one. Huh? The Chiefs. That's where I was going with it, okay? What are they chiefs of? Why are they the Chiefs? Why do we use names like that? It used to be the Cleveland Indians, used to be the Washington Redskins. I taught at Penfield High School, which used to be the Penfield Chiefs. Now they're the Patriots. In fact, I think the education department in New York now says that all public high schools that have any kind of connection to the indigenous people have to give up those nicknames because they are demeaning. And, that's something for you to think about also, if you would, and to bring up, if you like. In Penfield, we had the Penfield Chiefs. When they switched to Penfield Patriots, some of the kids were outraged. We're the Chiefs, we'll always be the Chiefs. My son was one of them. Dad, once a chief, always a chief. I said, what were you ever a chief of? It's a hanging on to something that isn't real, and I think it's a bit racist. And if you don't agree with my statements like that, throw something at me, or I saw a couple mugs out there. Don't throw mugs at me, but raise your hand and tell me how wrong I am, because I don't mind that. There was also a middle school which they sold off, and it's now the Charles G. Finney School. That was once a middle school for the Penfield School District, called Denonville. Do you know who Denonville was? He was a French military leader who was sent here to wipe out the Seneca Indians. The French had come down to St. Lawrence into Lake Ontario. He had 1,600 soldiers, 400 Canadians, and about 1,000 Indians in his forces. And their goal was to get to, first they stopped at what is now Seabreeze, put up what they called a fort, but a fort was, not really a fort that we would consider something a fort. And he left 400 men there to guard that. And then he continued on, landing at Irondequoit Bay and traveling down through what is now Penfield and so forth, heading towards what is now Victor. Denonville and his men, it was the largest army in North America to that time. I'm not sure if we had an army, yeah, I guess Washington's army maybe at times had numbers bigger than that. They destroyed the crops that were in the ground. They burnt the granary, the food that was being saved for the next year. And they destroyed over 100 longhouses. The goal was to wipe out the Seneca. Why wipe out the Seneca? Well, we'll get to that in just a couple of seconds. But Penfield saw it fit to name a middle school after that man who led that force. You can take it out of context of the time period if you'd like, but let's be aware that there's a history that we have projected onto the indigenous people. So I'm going to ask we look at a YouTube presentation that'll talk about something called the doctrine of discovery. It doesn't specifically talk about the Seneca or the Haudenosaunee, but it talks about some of the attitudes and the legalisms that are associated with how the indigenous people have been treated. So
heirs, all the islands and the mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered in the west and south, with all their dominions, cities, castles, towns, and villages.
Imagine a group of strangers walking into your home unannounced, pushing you and your family to the street because you don't practice their religion. This is essentially what was done to First Nations and Inuit by European colonizers. They did this under what is called the Doctrine of Discovery, which came from a series of authorizations called Papal Bulls, written in 1493.
Papal bulls really were a way of sort of dividing up the globe between different competing imperial Catholic powers, most notably Spain, and they were done by Pope Nicholas V and then his successor, Alexander VI. And the basic idea of the papal bulls were that these imperial powers had a religious responsibility to win these new lands and territories for the Catholic Church. And the kind of sweetener for them was that any lands or territories that were held by non-Christians were available for them to claim. So it effectively dispossessed indigenous people who at that time were not Christian.
So why does the Doctrine of Discovery have an effect on modern-day Canada? Well, it actually starts down south with a legal case in the United States over, well, you guessed it, indigenous land.
This dispute ended up in the Supreme Court of the United States with a guy by the name of Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time.
The case was called Johnson and McIntosh, and in 1823, the court was deciding who owns a parcel of indigenous land down in Illinois. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall heard the case. When it came time to write his decision, he didn't really rely on anything that was argued in front of him.
In his research, he came across this doctrine of discovery. And it is that you can, if you take up the lands, you have title to the lands. And that follows on this Pope's Papal Bull, and that was the way it became part of the law. It's evolved on the basis of a legal fiction. There is no such thing as the law of doctrine of discovery. There is no such thing. He decided it, relied on the doctrine of discovery to come up with these legal principles that Indians never owned their lands. They weren't capable of owning their lands, and they were owned by whichever monarch discovered them.
And what happens in the United States usually ends up happening here in Canada. That brings us to 1888 and the St. Catharines Milling Lumber ruling. The case was over whether Ontario or Canada had jurisdiction over non-reserve territory in Treaty 3. Canada issued the lumber company a license to harvest timber around Wabigoon Lake. Ontario challenged it, arguing it owned rights to timber in the area. They turned to the courts to decide who owned the trees. The case ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada, which said, in part, All this country was once occupied by Indian tribes. On its discovery by Europeans, the discoverers acquired a right of property in the soil, provided that discovery was followed by possession. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that Canada owned the land, but for decades, First Nations peoples have taken their land rights to every level of court in the country, from Vancouver to Halifax and the Arctic. The Supreme Court has heard it all, and it looks as though things are changing.
In modern times, we still have Aboriginal title. It's that right to occupy and use the land. We can't sell it to anybody. We have to get the consent of the Crown or the Canadian government. That's how our law has evolved. It's been on the fictional basis that the discovery gave the discoverer absolute title to our lands, and the Indians were left with nothing but right to occupy and use the land. It has value now because that use and occupation comes with a duty to consult, and that's a constitutional right for Indigenous people. In other words, if you want a corporation to use your land, you have to deal with the Aboriginal title. Before, that just never happened.
So if the doctrine of discovery is legal fiction, why doesn't the Vatican rescind it?
The problem is there's no mechanism for doing that. And my own personal theory about this is it has something to do with another 19th century doctrine, papal infallibility. If you want to project this image of an eternal, unchanging monolith, if you have these papal bulls and you rescind them, how is that going to affect your idea about papal infallibility? It's really going to call it into question. So I think probably what Pope Francis would prefer to do is what he did with residential schools, to say this was an error, but not necessarily rescind it, because there isn't a way to do that.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action call on every level of government and religious group to reject the doctrine of discovery. Land back is a common theme across the country now, as First Nations peoples call for the government to give back what is rightfully ours. Whether the government will actually honor the calls for land back, well, that's another story. The federal government passed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples law in Canada. It describes the doctrine of discovery as racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. So, will there be a day when Canada says enough is enough? Well, there seem now to be cracks forming in Canada over support of the doctrine of discovery in court. In a January 2022 ruling, Justice Nigel Kent of the Supreme Court of British Columbia essentially said that Canada's takeover is simply a colonial power grab. But former Justice Laforme believes it will never truly go away.
There'll be something else to take its place, because you can imagine the disruption and everything that it's going to cause. Maybe you have to go back and reassess the compensation or something like that for all of Canada to Indigenous people, and I just don't see that happening.
Hey everyone, Daryl Stranger here. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you just saw, you should check out some of our other videos, and you should also subscribe.
So
Most people have no clue that in
yeah, Tom. Okay, good question. And you asked part of that question before we got started. By the way, again, questions are invited, they're encouraged, so please come forward. Ed and I were talking before about some of the names that have transcended, have come to our time. And then this question about the Iroquois versus the Haudenosaunee, and then the First Nations. And that was very much, that presentation was very much Canadian-based. And Canada refers to them as First Nation. Okay? I'm not even sure if they use words like Haudenosaunee in Canada. I should have looked that up. But First Nation, they were the first nation to be there. And I'm coming to the answer to your questions. Steve Gretz asked me, way back when I first started talking about doing this, he said, who was here before the Haudenosaunee? Did they push somebody out as they got pushed out? And I've never been able to find that answer. I had a long conversation with a member of the Onondaga Nation about different things, including that. He said, we don't know. And the only way you could find out would be through, I started to say architecture, and I didn't mean to say that. Thank you, archaeology. And he said, I don't want to talk about art. I don't want to talk about it because it's grave robbing to me, So we don't have an answer to that. And I'm getting to your answer eventually, trust me. For the longest time, we said that the first indigenous people came into what is now the United States area between 20 and 30,000 years ago, when the changes in climate created a land bridge. They came over from Asia and began to migrate east and south. Most recently, the term, the years 12,000 years ago are used, maybe because of some different feelings about the ice covering and so forth. So we don't know when they got here. And I don't think we're going to find out anytime soon, okay? Now, who are the Iroquois? The Iroquois were the native peoples here when the French came and began to label them. Iroquois is a French word. That's why you sometimes will hear people say Iroquois, because it ends in O-I-S. A French word ending that way would sound like Iroquois, not Iroquois. The five nations that made up the beginning of the Haudenosaunee don't call themselves that. They call themselves the Haudenosaunee. That's a word that means people of the longhouses, which is the longhouse is not only their structure, but their culture, their government. We'll say more about it as we go along. So Haudenosaunee, people of the longhouse, it's the names that they prefer to be called themselves, not the Iroquois. Those. Stop and think about how Indians have been presented to you in your lives. Very often they're caricatures. Very often they're just the bad guys. Not too long ago, I was sitting in my favorite chair looking for a movie to watch. I was bored. And something came up, and it starred Willie Nelson, John Wayne. There's a combination, huh? And I forget a couple others. And it was called Stagecoach. It's an old Western. So I said, what the heck? So I start watching it. And Willie Nelson is playing the part of Doc Holliday in a way that has nothing at all to do with Doc Holliday, other than Doc Holliday was a dentist, and in this movie, he's I was a dentist. But I think, why is Willie Nelson in a movie that is going to be kind of putting down the Indians? Because the plot of the movie is we're going to get this stagecoach through the Apache land because those cutthroat, bloodthirsty Apache will kill us all. What a way to, Well, Willie Nelson is playing Doc Holliday, who's saying, well, it's manifest destiny. It's stealing land, if you want to think of it that way. And everybody else in the stagecoach is talking about the bloodthirsties and the bad and so on. So that's where the movie was going. Now, probably a 2-hour movie, hour and 50 minutes or so, you don't see a single native person. You just keep hearing about them. And then all of a sudden, as the stagecoach is getting closer to its destination, here they come. Well, they're screaming, hollering, shooting arrows and everything else. And it's about 5 minutes of that. It isn't about the native peoples at all. It's a bastardization of a proud people. That, to me, is one of the ways that we were taught about Indians growing up. I remember, some of you are almost as old as I am. Mad Magazine, anybody? There was one, you see the the shadow of some kids in a movie theater, and they're screaming and hollering, get those Indians, get them, get them, get them. And then the last one, they're Indian kids rooting against the Indians because that's what's been taught to them. And of course, in their way, they were, presenting Indians.
So, we keep saying Indians, and I, as a kindergarten teacher myself, we're not saying Indians, we're saying Native Americans. Yet I went to the Museum and Science Center last week, and, no, and it says Indian, 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 Indian everywhere, which is exactly what I'm fighting. We're not gonna say this all over. Why is it so prevalent in all the literature there, and you're saying it's still, and yet I'm fighting like crazy to teach my students, we're not saying that word because they're not from India.
Yeah.
What is the,
Did you all hear the question? We're teaching kids, we're trying to teach kids not to say Indians because they're not from India. That was supposedly Columbus's mistake. And, talking about Christopher Columbus, what in the hell does Christopher Columbus have to do with the United States? Never been here, never had anything to do with it. At any rate, titles, labels, why are some people still saying the Iroquois Confederacy instead of the Haudenosaunee?
which is what I am still teaching because that's in my literature.
And it's considered acceptable in most places. There's a difficulty in knowing how to deal with the history of these people. Okay? Cheryl.
Which is great, I'm glad to hear that. But so, again, going back to why is all that literature at the Science Center, who works so closely with and has so many people who are native on their staff, saying Indians everywhere?
Well, it's. It's old speak, is what it is. Remember, the doctrine of discovery started in the 1600s, okay? That it was okay for any nation that wanted to take over an area to create Christianity, that was their land to take over. And do you know when it was completely lifted? 3 years ago. It's been involved in international law for that whole time. Different groups, different places have dealt with it. So there's part of the answer. It's old speak. When did the doctrine get done away with? When the current pope said so. And it was the pope in the 1600s, the papal bulls, that started this theory to protect Christianity and save the souls of the people who were there. How often have we heard about organized religion wanting to save the souls of people without knowing who they are? Your question, I was going to say this is going to be part of my talk later, but I'm going to use it now. Syracuse University, their College of Arts and Sciences, in order to recognize the heritage and culture of the Haudenosaunee, begin every major event with the following statement. Now, you have a statement here that says, "We acknowledge with respect the Seneca Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose ancestral lands the town of Greece and the city of Rochester now occupy. We encourage every member of our community to learn about the original inhabitants of the land." That's an important statement. All by itself is an important statement. So what does Syracuse University say? Syracuse University would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And allegedly, and I assume it's right, they use that statement before every major event in the university and the College of Arts and Sciences. Tom, you look like you have a question about that.
Back when I went to Syracuse, out of the orange was not your motto, Saltine Warrior was your motto.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Saltine Warrior is the one that they set up. It was a statue on campus of the Native American person. And the fights on
let me give you a hint about history. It changes as we learn more. It gets improved as we learn more. And you know, I have taught history in one setting or another probably 40 years. And I've always taught history, so it's always about people. And that becomes a very important part as we try to understand other people. In 2028, Steve had put up in here that the next Olympics will be in 2028 in Los Angeles. President Biden has joined in a call for an indigenous team flag for an indigenous team cross players. They will not be, if this is accepted by the Olympic Committee, they will not be considered part of the American team. They will be the Haudenosaunee team. Because I see clapping going on, and that's as it should be. They invented the game. They play in world competitions, and there's an effort to make that happen. Write somebody about it, right? You know, push for that. Lacrosse was last part of the Olympics in competition, not experiment. You know, not what's the word they use? I don't know. Thank you. Something about age. Some words just don't come forward. Not an exhibition sport, but the last time it was a competitive sport was in 1948. Okay? And, you know, but skateboarding made it. Okay. Any questions or comments based on anything I've said so far or that you saw up there? A lot of the tribal recognition, at least in the East, and I think you can probably go west also a bit, have to do with language. Who spoke what language? I was saying to Ed before, my hometown is Merrick, M-E-R-R-I-C-K. It's on Long Island. The name comes from Maroki, which was the name of an Indian Native American indigenous people grouping that were part of the Algonquian language. And so they identified with that, and to whatever extent, and I don't know the history of it, but to whatever extent they came together with other people in that area, the Merokis, you know, became Merrick. So it's not everybody. And let's get to yes.
I know people read some of the sign languages universal between different tribes through, I'm not just talking this area. Well, is that something that because of the located across the states? Or?
You're asking me if the sign languages were, I don't know how to answer that. Okay. I suspect that with sign language is often commonality. And not an easy thing to pick up.
I also know that we knew that Pipestone, that was a national park, Pipestone, that was a place that was considered not the one this area was, but I'm talking generalized tribes, that was a place of peace because of finding the peace pipe stone. Tribes would meet there that spoke different languages and
Yeah, well, I don't know, and I do know that sign language, once it's learned across groups, is very useful and powerful, but very difficult. My wife was dying a couple years ago and lost her ability to speak. And she taught herself sign language. And she wanted in the worst way, she wanted me to be able to speak with her. And I tried. I bought a couple of books. I tried. I watched videotape. I could not learn how to do sign language. It still pains me a great deal that here was my wife who wanted to be able to communicate with me and couldn't, and I couldn't help her with that because it's difficult to do. So let me get away from that. Who are the Haudenosaunee? Steve said I have until 1:30 to talk. I only have a couple minutes left, I know. But let me lay this out there. And then next week we can talk more about the actual history about how they became who they are and so forth. That because today I had hoped to be able to lay out there some of the disrespect and the lack of knowledge of these people that led them to become the victims of somebody like Denonville, Marquis de Denonville, a French military leader. And like a lot of Frenchmen from that time period, his name was about that long. I only have, a little bit. So who are the Haudenosaunee? People who build a longhouse. I will talk next week about the structure of a longhouse, the culture of the longhouse, and so forth. Commonly called the Iroquois Confederacy, the proper name indicates diversity. The Haudenosaunee are different people of the longhouse. Each nation in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy has its own identity. There are the Mohawk, people of the Flint, or keepers of the eastern door, responsible for protecting and defending the eastern boundaries of Haudenosaunee. There are the Oneida, people of the standing stone. Then the Onondaga, people of the hills, keepers of the central fire. How did they get to be the keepers of the central fire? Because there was a sorcerer who was causing evil. And there was a Seneca man, what was it, Onondaga? A Seneca man by the name of Hiawatha, whose wife and daughters died because of this sorcerer. And they convinced him, the sorcerer, to turn his soul, turn his heart into peace and love, with the promise that if he did that, then the Onondaga could be the center of the Haudenosaunee forever. I'll say more about that next week. The Cayuga, people of the Great Swamp. I wonder how they feel about that. And then, of course, the Seneca, people of the Great Hill, or keepers of the Western Door. So they're all, and then the Tuscarora joined later. So they're all different nations brought together under one umbrella in the way that we have 50 states under one government. And there are those who say that the Americans learned about government and diversity in government from the Haudenosaunee. Anybody want to say or ask anything more before we have to go? I don't want to hold you. Hope this had something good for you. I hope you can come back next week and I'll get more into the very definite history. Oh, you're too kind. Good to see you all here.